The immediate reason was that at the time, with the success of social media and so forth in, 2010, 2011, there was generally, people were expecting that you could do the same in terms of retail commerce, super apps. Uber was coming out, Amazon was on fire. So people were thinking, why can't we do this with healthcare? Why can't we do this with banking? Who's going to be the Facebook of banking? And so there was an opportunity to raise funding off of that. And also, there's a bit of, if you can make it in, we're based out of New York. If you can make it in New York, you can make it anywhere. But, New York was the financial capital of the world. So we wanted to prove it was possible. We were just too early. We were a few years too early. If you look at a lot of the design patterns we created, we were the first mobile app in the world to offer you the ability to sign up for a debit card in the app. Now, as you rightly pointed out, the regulators wanted us to get a wet signature back in those days. That was still the dominant view. So we had to prove that our identity verification process was as robust as someone walking into the branch. And I can't talk about in detail exactly how we proved that because it involves the bank partner that we had at the time. But just suffice to say that we were able to show that there was a much higher abuse of synthetic identities in branch than there was through our online identity verification process. And that was what enabled us to get the initial tests that the regulator would allow us to bring on a certain number of customers. And then after, we had successfully had the first 5,000, then the next 5,000, the next 10,000 and so forth like that until they were comfortable with it. But, we created a lot of design patterns that are still in use by challenger banks today. We were the first mobile banking app in the world that didn't have a list of accounts on the homepage when you fired up the banking app, we had this thing we called the spending meter, which was an artifact that showed you how much money you'd spent, a circular artifact on the homepage, and the app would turn red if you were spending above your typical spending, or the app would turn green if you were spending below your typical spending. That sort of circular artifact to show you your money use is now very common amongst the neos. That became a design pattern. Our real-time receipting, capability with instant categorization of your spend. You see that in mobile wallets like Apple Pay and others now. So, we really pioneered a lot of, those features of sort of mobile banks. So I feel like we made a big contribution to that movement as a whole.
Why aren't banks adopting this technology more and kind of using you as the guinea pig and saying, hey, this is something that we can move towards? I believe in a talk you talked about either Alipay or, WeChat Pay, I'm not sure exactly which one, have been less than 1% worth of fraud, where traditional banks in North America, it has to be way more than that. Fraud has been plaguing organizations. Anyone touching any kind of e-commerce or financial services have been plagued by fraud. Why aren't we adopting more of what's being used in Asia, what you've seen for almost decades? And we're still kind of at the same point where they want people to come into the branch.
No, I mean, if you are listening to this and you're in the States right now, I'm going to give you some truth that's a bit shocking. And that is that if you are using a Chinese mobile wallet in China or, elsewhere, Alipay is in 130 countries now. If you're using that wallet, you are 10,000 times less likely to suffer from fraud compared with using a credit card online in the United States. And I'll give you the hard numbers. The fraud rates for Alipay at their peak, which is generally during Singles Day, November 11th. We don't have the numbers on, well, we do have the numbers on Singles Day in terms of that. We don't have the Alipay transaction numbers right now, but it's sure to be over 500,000 transactions per second, which is about 10 times the combined power of all the card schemes right now. And they get 0.0006 basis points of fraud compared with 11.2 basis points of fraud for card not present in the United States. Now, why is that? The reality is you can't secure a credit card number anymore. I mean, that's the reality. You can tokenize and that gives you some protection, but the PAN, your 16-digit credit card number is no longer secure really. And there's other elements to this as well. The push feature versus pull, so, right now the card schemes have a pull mechanism where they authorize from the bank. And the only authorization is this card is requested to make a transaction. Is there enough money in the account to support this transaction? Secondarily, we now have some fraud systems coming in that are behaviorally based and things like that. Whereas on the mobile wallets like Alipay, it's a push system. So even if you are transacting with a merchant, you have to confirm the transaction in the app yourself. So it's not the bank confirm or authorizing the transaction. It's the card owner or the account owner rather, confirming the transaction. But the biggest element is undoubtedly the fact that, Alipay uses digital identity. It uses biometric identity mechanisms. You have, a number of those. You have a fingerprint or voice recognition to get into the app. You use facial recognition for identity verification. This, facial recognition system is broadly in use in China. It gets a lot of grief over that in the States because of civil rights, but the reality is that that stuff works. The identity, and it's a new tech stack. They have new rails, new tech stack built from the ground up, and they're not sort of trying to retrofit new mechanisms of fraud control and so forth on an older tech stack. So there's a number of reasons, but they're the main ones.
That's what I was going to ask you about is, what are your thoughts about China? And now we're seeing a lot emerging out of India being the new leader. We're seeing BRICS come out, the de-dollarization of the US dollar, the move away from the US dollar, the move away from US being a powerhouse. I think globally now, from the last 20 years, we've always seen as US people looking towards the US to be kind of like be the mover and shaker amongst the world. And we're now seeing that kind of move away where people are kind
Yeah.
of, protesting the US every chance they get. What are your thoughts? And then what's the downside of that where the US, who maybe has a little bit more about consumer protection and human rights, a little bit more than the rest of those countries that are emerging? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, you have all the human rights you want in the US unless you're poor, you know. And then, access to healthcare and education and so forth is obviously a struggle. So, I think ideologically, the US has some real issues in terms of its identity right now. We're going through a lot of, policy and politics around that in terms of, and there's a big effort right now for the US not to make these progressive moves in terms of policy and so forth as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, that sort of translates in the business arena and so forth, particularly when it comes to things like banking and also the way the government system works today, which is essentially bought and sold for by corporations who, have the lobbying groups that can pay for laws to be shaped according to their criteria and so forth. That all of that is part of the complexity of the system here. Ironically, you have, Silicon Valley, which is a massive engine of innovation, but that innovation has to be put within the culture that's in the US. Whereas if you look elsewhere around the world, particularly in respect to things like payments and the growth of these fintechs, it's clear China is 10 years ahead of the US on things like central bank digital currencies, real-time payments, and reform of the banking sector as a whole. Even with the tech clampdown that they've had in China, they're still making tremendous progress on those fronts. The biggest answer I get, to that when I talk with American CEOs of banks about that is, yeah, but that's communism. Like, well, it's not really, it's technology. And so if you look at PixPay in Brazil or look at Paytm in India, the same is true of that. So everywhere else in the world is sort of making this move towards these real-time financial systems, low friction, highly accessible, integrated financial services. And the US is still saying you need to go to a bank and sign a piece of paper. That's essentially where we're at. So the US will have to change. The question will be whether that change is forced upon them because of the way cross-border trading and smart contracts and AI will be implemented from a commerce perspective, or whether, they have that come to Jesus technology moment and see that these are the building blocks of a modern, 21st century economy. I'm not sure what will be the catalyst, but right now the US is just continuing to fall further behind.